after the release of Red Dead Redemption 2, we did not receive any games for almost 4 years that broke new ground. Red Dead Redemption 2 was an incredibly powerful game, one that brought in a new evolution to the NPC and quest design system, creating a living, breathing ecosystem in its own right, along with a world that truly felt alive. The characters had stories beyond your interactions with them. You could find them out in the wild doing things on their own, or simply go with them for side missions and get to know a little bit more about them outside of the main story. The game was so good, everybody considered it a generational leap, just like they do each time Rockstar comes out with a new game. Then, silence. There was nothing of that scope and scale for almost 4 years in the gaming world, and then came Elden Ring. From Software changed the way we look at open worlds. They changed the way we see stories in gaming. They had been doing this style of game for a while, but now they had brought it to the mainstream, the conventional audiences, and it's safe to say that everyone absolutely loved it, including myself. The game was spectacular. It had a visceral art direction, punchy combat unlike anything from had done before, except Sekiro. That game is wild, and a world that truly felt alive once again. There is a point to mentioning these things. There's essentially nothing similar between Red Dead Redemption 2 and Elden Ring, except for the fact that it got the industry pissed off. Every single developer in the world was mad. Every single publisher that wasn't Take-Two Interactive or Bandai Namco was made. Their games wouldn't have the same level of power anymore, because the industry standard had completely changed. Now it's 2023, and it's happening all over again, because Baldur's Gate 3 is a freaking masterpiece. The tweet that started it all. Baldur's Gate 3 was a highly anticipated role-playing video game. It is being developed and published by Larian Studios, a studio known for creating some of the most prolific computer RPGs in the world. It is based on the Dungeons & Dragons, D&D tabletop role-playing game, and is set in the iconic Forgotten Realms universe. The game combines the rich storytelling and deep character customization of D&D with modern CRPG mechanics, visuals, and AAA presentation. Over the course of many years, the game had already garnered significant attention and excitement from both fans and developers in the gaming industry due to its pedigree. The success of Larian Studios' previous titles also played into it, most notably their Divinity, Original Sin series. However, this excitement has also led to some concerns within the developer community, which honestly, it makes me laugh. So here's the deal. Some developers are freaking out because they're worried that Baldur's Gate 3 is setting a new standard for RPGs, and that's got them shaking in their boots. You've got these tweets flying around like crazy, and it all started with a Twitter thread by Xalavier Nelson Jr. from Strange Scaffold, the folks behind games like Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator. Yeah, that's a mouthful. Anyway, Xalavier laid out some legit reasons why BG3 might be a bit of an outlier in the RPG landscape. He had a bunch of points to make, which I will lay out before thrashing you all with my opinion of this whole story. Xalavier talked about the long road this game has traveled. The development kicked off in 2017, and that's a long time in the game development space. Not to mention, Larian Studios have already conjured up some serious CRPG magic with Divinity, Original Sin 1 and 2. Those games were masterpieces, but they were like a practice run, fine-tuning their skills and gathering some serious institutional knowledge, as Xalavier puts it, which is just a fancy way of saying they know what they're doing. Baldur's Gate 3 spent a whopping 3 years in the early access phase, getting feedback from the community, squashing bugs, and making bank. Plus, Larian didn't just summon a couple of developers from their magical hat. They've got over 400 of them spread across 7 offices. It's like a wizarding school for game development over there. And hold up, don't forget the Dungeons & Dragons license they snagged. They essentially had the keys to a kingdom of fantasy and adventure. With all this in their arsenal, it's no wonder some developers are sweating bullets. Xalavier is worried that Baldur's Gate 3 could set the bar so high that other RPGs, especially those from smaller studios, might feel the pressure to measure up. And that's where the panic train is chugging along. This tweet was basically the start of many other developers jumping in to talk about why Baldur's Gate 3 is an anomaly. The developers chime in. As always, Twitter is a hub for horrible takes, and once a horrible take is out there, other horrible takes will go out in support of it. Developers from all corners of the industry chimed with their 2 cents on the Baldur's Gate 3 hype, and talked about why the game shouldn't be seen as a raised standard for game design, but rather something atypical, something that should have not happened. Ryan McCabe, the design honcho over at Insomniac Games, gave it a retweet, telling folks not to go all in on using just one game as the golden standard for RPGs. He's like, hey, that's not gonna get us anywhere, and it's kinda like chasing a unicorn. Then you've got Josh Sawyer, the mastermind behind design at Obsidian Entertainment. He talks about how having a solid foundation and the cash to build your RPG castle just the way you want is not a usual circumstance for game developers. Chris Balzer, a senior designer on Diablo 4 vibes with Nelson Jr.'s tweet. He states that not every game dojo operates in the same dojo conditions. He compared Baldur's Gate 3 to Ultima 7, the RPG sweetheart of Larian's big boss, Sven Vinka. He's saying Ultima 7 had a whole legacy of 12 years of RPG goodness to build upon. This in particular is a very random take, and the one that annoyed me most. It's almost as if Diablo 4 didn't have 3 other games to build from, yet they made a live service cash cow unlike anything ever before. There are even more tweets, but I don't want to dive into them too much. This discourse has been covered by almost every single person in the gaming world, and it isn't something that I want to hammer on. I just want to talk about how ridiculous it is that developers are talking out about why this shouldn't be a raised standard. So I think it's time that I share my thoughts on this as well. Anomaly or genius? Despite the claims of Larian having unlimited resources to make their games, it's not something you just come upon randomly. Larian Studios didn't just stumble upon their resources overnight. Nah, they've been on this journey through the messed up industry for decades. They started with stuff like Divine Divinity, Beyond Divinity, and then the Divinity Original Sin series. Each game was like a stepping stone on a path paved with passion, experience, and a whole lot of trial and error. That was only half the battle. To prove that they could handle Dungeons and Dragons as an IP for their next game, they had to prove themselves as developers with unlimited resources and experience. So, they created Divinity Original Sin 2, a game that brought them not only that experience, but also a huge chunk of the funding. That game proved to Wizards of the Coast that Larian was now more capable than ever before to handle a world as big as Dungeons and Dragons. And so, they finally got the license to create Baldur's Gate 3. Divinity Original Sin 2 is also the game where Larian realized their early access strategy. They released Divinity Original Sin 2 for early access in 2016, and the full game then came out in 2017. Their early access strategy is quite unique, and it is definitely something that we should talk about. Larian doesn't just drop games out of thin air, they have a masterful strategy behind each release now. In the case of Baldur's Gate 3, the scope was simply too large, and so they released it in early access like a sneak peek. It only featured the first act of the game and gave you a small insight into what you can find in the game's world. This was cool, because unlike most other games, this early access was for literally every single person who wanted to play it. It wasn't just for Americans or for streamers and YouTubers, it was for the player base, the players who would go on to make this game a successful project eventually. You see, this move was like casting a spell to gather feedback, hunt down those pesky bugs, and polish that game to a mirror shine. 6 years after development started, we now know why Larian was able to pull this off. They are a studio that operates within its own capabilities. They create the games that they want to, and their CEO, Sven Vinka, is a man of actual principles in the corporate gaming world. Sven Vinka talked recently about an offer from Microsoft to buy them, the whole company. But as tempting as that may have sounded to him, he said no to that deal. Why would anyone say no to being bought out by Microsoft? Well, Sven Vincke did not want any corporate puppet masters to be Larian's overlord. He didn't want to compromise on the quality of their games for a bigger profit potential. Larian held a shield of integrity and stood firm against the forces of greed. They knew that true gamers don't want to be nickel and dimed for every little thing. Nah, they wanted to craft a game that's all about the adventure, the story, and the magic of exploration. So Larian took a stand, held their ground, and created a realm free from the clutches of microtransaction monsters. Now, looking back to Xalavier Nelson Jr.'s tweet and the discourse that it has caused, I'd like to say that a game's size doesn't guarantee its quality. Not every game is created by a team of 400 people, and that's absolutely okay. There are smaller indie games that have made a lasting impact on me more than huge games. AAA titles like Elden Ring, Red Dead Redemption 2, or even Baldur's Gate 3 will. It doesn't matter that the game has a huge budget. It doesn't matter if you're able to put your game in early access or not. The quality of a game is its own thing. I'm a huge fan of the ROG Ally, as you may know by the channel's name and most of my content, and I love that I have access to hundreds of indie games that are quite literally life-changing experiences. Inside, for example, was a tiny game, so short, and yet it enters your brain like a bullet and never leaves. The indie developers that are talking about Baldur's Gate 3 being a raised standard have nothing to worry about. Their games were never going to be competing against AAA titles anyways. They're in a world of their own compared to the conventional AAA market. As for the developers from studios like Insomniac, Blizzard, and such, this game is absolutely a raised standard. Baldur's Gate 3 has hit over 800,000 concurrent players on Steam since its release, which makes it one of the biggest games to ever come out on PC. So people have realized it quite well, that quality matters above all when you're paying $70 for a video game. Yes, your live service games are a model that has made you incredible amounts of money, but it doesn't make us happy to play them anymore. If it doesn't work for consumers, if the players don't want it, then that should be the end all be all. The standards are changing because people don't like being taken advantage of. They don't like their money being pulled out of their pockets for a cool-looking virtual hat. If you're making a video game, it has to be complete. It can be 10 hours long or 100 hours long, but it needs to be made with passion. It needs to break new ground, or at least build upon the foundations already laid out by other games, and it needs to be a complete game. At the end of the day, people want to have good experiences. They don't want to spend 20 hours grinding out the Battle Pass Diablo 4. The gaming scene is changing for the better, and expectations are going to be raised. Standards will change for the AAA scene, and I more than ever am so on board with this that I can't wait to run through Baldur's Gate 3 just to show my support, even if CRPGs aren't my thing.